As the prophet of esports, I rely on trustworthy and meaningful data every day. Data from our research partner YouGov offers the most complete view of esports fans and gamers in the world, providing context to who they are, what they think, the brands they buy, and things they do. YouGov's connected insights and research services inform strategy at every level. If you're a team, a brand, agency, or rights holder, you should be talking with YouGov. Their partners measure and maximize ROI and are telling compelling stories with data. Visit yougov.com/gaming-esports to learn more. Let's move on to another publisher here, because this one's also an interesting story, William. And I know you were excited to talk about some of the repercussions of this. But this was from Reuters, and the headline here is Ubisoft invests in free-to-play games, signals profits might fall. So Ubisoft warned that their financial year, that profits might fall this financial year, and that they may look to create new free-to-play titles. So, they have some existing free-to-play games, but their view, and I'll just read this quote directly. It's now time to come up with high-quality free-to-play games across all our biggest franchises, across all platforms, but of course it will take time. So I think there's this interesting, and this you keyed in on this right away, William, and so I'm just going to borrow it.
Yeah, you're just going to steal it from me.
I am. There's this interesting dichotomy here of, warning about profits falling, but then simultaneously saying we want to do more free-to-play. Can you explain how we reconcile those seemingly two things that are opposing?
Yeah, because if you think about it intuitively, can you imagine a company 10 years ago saying this, we're not making as much money. The solution is to give more stuff away, right? You'd be like if this were, back in the, early 2000s, you'd be like, I'm really worried about that. That seems like a terrible management choice. But two things. One is it shows, it's so many things, right? One is it shows the power, how commonly accepted free-to-play is as a business model today, and how basically clearly assumed it is in the industry that free-to-play is a path to high revenues, not, giving away quality games, right? So it's really interesting in that regard, right? Yep. Two is it shows you companies being forced to migrate more and more free-to-play, right? Because the interesting thing here is this isn't like, if it were the scenario where profits were record up, so we're doing more free-to-play development, you can't, it wouldn't have the same impact as this is a solution. Basically, the companies that are all doing well right now have very significant free-to-play staples. And the companies that maybe are anticipating, saying, I'm not saying Ubisoft isn't doing very well. It's a great company. But, if they're anticipating a profit fall, they're almost being forced to do more free-to-play to combat that. So it's interesting that the mechanism is there to push free-to-play more and more. The third thing I would say is, it is interesting how many large successful publishers still don't have the suite of free-to-play titles that you would think make sense given these two trends we just described, right? Look at Call of Duty. Call of Duty did not have free-to-play until, what was it, this year? Last year, right? Basically last year.
Warzone. When Warzone came out. A year and a half, maybe?
Year and a half, yeah. That's crazy. That is crazy. And think of all the amazing games that amazing games. I can just tell you, Ubisoft's done some of my favorite titles of all time. Mirror's Edge. No, Mirror's Edge was EA. Sorry, I shouldn't say that. That was DICE. But they did Prince of Persia, right? Which I just, to this day, I absolutely love that title. I think
Assassin's Creed 655.
Yeah.
How
Watch
many
Dogs,
1,000 Assassin's Creed
which
games?
I know is, maybe not. But they make brilliant games, right? And isn't it crazy that, actually Assassin's Creed, isn't it crazy that there isn't a free-to-play Assassin's Creed offering in this day and age, right? Isn't it crazy? That seems crazy to me, because I know what you're going to say. Oh, it's a single-player experience. It's narrative-driven. Those games don't have that. And the answer I would have to that is, then, look, your property Assassin's Creed is not, it's so much more than just a narrative-driven historical game, right? It's it's a consumer base. It's a larger world. It's also like a style of gameplay, and I can't imagine that not working well in a free-to-play model if you're smart and you think expansively about the title and what it can do. I mean, if you have a property that can tell stories in the future, in ancient Rome, and in Viking lands, I think you can figure out how to make some of that free-to-play somehow. You already have a pretty expansive, flexible IP there. And look, I mean, as much as I hate to say it, like I think, and this is a weird example to cite, but even if you want more narrative-driven games, I think Grand Theft Auto and the success that's happened there with GTA Online points to how narrative-driven games can still have a second life with a post-monetization model that looks more like free-to-play, right?
Yeah, I think part of it is just they need to tell this story, right? Because you have, EA that crushed their earnings call, right? And a lot of the one thing they focused on more than anything was the growth in Apex.
Yep.
Right. And so if you're Ubisoft, you're going and you're looking at that going, well, we have to say we're doing something there too, right? You're sort of forced to play along because you're seeing your competitors have success with free to play. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. No, and I think that's so interesting that like that's the forcing mechanism in the market today to free to play. Like I know I said that before. I just think it's so fascinating that like that's the world we live in, that like publishers are being made to migrate more and more into this model. So I hope people like free to play, because I think it's not just the wave of the future, it is the future. Anyway, keep going, Paul. Sorry.
No, the second point I was going to make is, and I know I'm going to get some pushback from you, but it's one of these situations where people want to go after sort of the easiest, or people want to get very cute and clever with the explanation, right? So yeah, growth is down, profits are down, but we're gonna fix it because we're gonna do more free to play, and this is the future, right? And
love the future.
And no one sort of just sat back maybe and said, could it be not because of business models or anything else, but just because Ubisoft really hasn't made a very good game in a while, right? Like maybe there's a simpler explanation here that has nothing to do with business model, that has nothing to do with free to play. And they're looking for sort of a fix and going, yeah, well, we'll just do a lot more free to play. And I just, if I'm an investor or potential shareholder looking at, am I going to buy Ubisoft stock? I'm going, I don't know if that gives me comfort that they've solved the real problem here.
Well, but I am going to push back. First of all, I don't know if I agree with the statement they haven't made a good game recently. But let for the sake of the argument we want to make here, because I think this is interesting. Let's just say that's true. Let's say your opinion is true, and Ubisoft, the Assassin's Creed titles are just too similar to each other. There's consumer fatigue, right? Something like that, right?
Yeah.
Couldn't you argue, and I think it's kind of interesting, that part of the reason maybe why there's some struggle there is because the games themselves weren't free to play to begin with? And let me unpack that a little. Is I think it's very difficult to separate game design from game monetization, right? Like I think you have problems in game world when games are developed and then people figure out how to monetize them later, right? Like games work when their monetization schema is fundamental to the development that proceeds in the title itself, right? So maybe the fact that they're on an older monetization schema, when customers want a free-to-play experience that lets them sample more, that lets them have more customizable content, that maybe offers more self-expression, because let's be honest, cosmetics are such a huge piece of the free-to-play business model. Couldn't you argue that features that you think are maybe missing from Ubisoft titles today are missing because they started from a premise of it's a $60 retail box copy and not this needs to be a long-term, persistent, microtransaction-driven experience? I'm not saying, I know people don't like microtransactions, but they lead to a style of game development that I think a lot of people like today. I think it's weird to say, but I think whether that's because we're used to it or because it's better, or I don't know, but I think people like it.
I mean, I like the argument, William, because I think that it's sound. But let's take it to its natural extreme here. Let's run it to the end of the course here. Okay,
let's not. But okay, yeah.
Which in my mind is okay. What you're basically saying is, if we make it free, people will have lowered expectations, and therefore subpar games will seem good in comparison, sort of thing, right? That's the 15,000th Assassin's Creed game, if it was free to play, might have been better received because it was cheap.
Well, no,
free.
No. That's not the argument. It's not that free, there's a lower perception of quality, so your game has to clear a lower bar. I think it changes the perceptual space a game exists in a more fundamental way. So let me use the example of Assassin's Creed. And again, the argument that, which I'm not sure I actually agree with, but let's just take it on premise that the Assassin's Creeds are too similar to each other year on year, right? Would you feel differently about it, Paul, if there was just the Assassin universe, right? And every 6 months they were announcing a new historical period for you to go to. You could purchase it as a $4.99 pack with story expansions and alternate playable assassins, and it adds up to $100 instead of $60. But like, would you maybe, instead of saying the game's too similar to each other, maybe you'd say, oh, it's so great how there's a new element of world building. The content's so fresh. I love the way I was in Rome last week, and now I paid $5 and I'm in Greece now, or I'm in Valhalla or wherever.
It's an interesting thought. It's a good argument.
Like the point I'm making is like it literally like this you could say you could argue that I'll go back to Grand Theft Auto Online, which is the example I kind of hold up for the narrative driven parallel here. Like you could argue like that's been the same game for like 3 console cycles. But because of how it's presented and because of how snackable it is, it doesn't wear out its welcome in the same way. And in fact, the similarities are a positive because people can drop in, come back, reconsume, right? And the familiarity there, it's like it's the same underlying fabric that's providing a consistent experience, which is so again, it's a weird argument to make, but I'm saying I think if the game were positioned differently, you might feel differently about it.
It's a good point. And by the way, shameless plug here, William's book, The Book of Esports, has a ton about business models and games and how the two things are tied together. So make sure you go read that and leave a review on Amazon, guys, because it is it does give you structure to think about some of these conversations we're having, which I think is interesting. And these conversations aren't going to go away, right? No. Like we're going to see a ton of changes, innovation, I think, in business models, where I think, to William's point, I think we are going to see more and more studios move to free to play because everyone's just, if you just look at the guy next door seeing it work, you're obviously tempted to do it yourself. And I think there's pressure, especially for public companies like Ubisoft, to emulate what the success stories look like.
Yep, completely.